So, John, I'm glad you read Isaiah 46 and closed off with verses 9 and 10. I'm God, there is no other. I'm God declaring the end from the beginning, there's none like me. So as it looks like the world is falling apart, remember that it's all actually coming together. You know, in alignment with God's word. He foretold these things. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you so much for the opportunity to gather, still in a free country. We pray that you protect us within this country and help this country turn itself around. We thank you for your word, your prophetic word. We know you gave it to us because you loved us, that you are outside of time. You know the end from the beginning. And we thank you for caring enough for us to share your word so we can be prepared for the days in which we live. And that's what we're going to try to do tonight, Lord. Be with us, bless us, edify us, and prepare us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, round 2. How many of you were here last night? What are you, gluttons for punishment? Okay. I'm going to be talking about Ezekiel 38. I'm sure John has taught on this prophecy several times, if not more. Teaching from a 3-disc DVD that we did with Prophecy Watcher Studio, When God Defends Israel. We sold those out last night, so I have my website up here. If you are interested in any resources from that DVD, you can get them at prophecydepot.com. I also want to introduce you to, we have a prophecyheadlines.com. If you want to get a clue of what's going on a daily news site, this is our Bible newspaper, prophecyheadlines.com, that examines current events through the prophetic lens. So we put things on daily about what we think is important, have prophetic implications. So I invite you to go there every day and kind of get your daily news, not your fake news, but your true news. So if you're here last night, you noticed I like to play trailers before I talk about a certain subject, so you can kind of get a clue of what I'm going to be talking about. Well, we're going to do that again. I can get a little sound on this.
The world is about to receive a shocking wake-up call. According to an ancient prophecy found in the book of Ezekiel, the God of the Bible is going to put the world on official notice that he is the one true God.
The prophet writes, "And in that day I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. And the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel."
Ezekiel foretells that in the last days, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and 6 other member nations will invade Israel from the far parts of the north. They are coming down to conquer Israel and take over its plunder and great booty. But the Lord, not America nor the Israeli Defense Forces, but the Lord, stops these invaders supernaturally with a great earthquake, pestilence, and bloodshed, flooding rains, great hailstones, and fire and brimstone. Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 provide every aspect of this foretold event. The stage is set, the prophecy is ready to happen, and now you can discover every detail and prepare yourself for this soon coming, powerful event. Now available, one of the most comprehensive videos ever produced on this topic, a 3-disc DVD produced by Prophecy Watchers TV, featuring Bill Salus and Mondo Gonzalez. This timely DVD is entitled Ezekiel 38, When God Defends Israel, the coming Russian-Iranian-led invasion of the Promised Land, and it explains every facet of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 foretellings. You will discover the coming greater and safer Israel that someday dwells securely without walls, bars, or gates, the timing, setting, and location of the Russian-Iranian-led invasion, the identity of the invaders, the motives of these attackers, the supernatural victory by the Lord, and the aftermath period when Israel buries the dead armies and converts their weapons into energy. You will learn all this and much, much more from the Ezekiel 38 When God Defends Israel 3-disc DVD. This is by far the most exhaustive video ever produced on Ezekiel 38 and 39. You need to prepare yourself and your family for these powerful end-time events that are coming. And that's exactly what the Ezekiel 38 When God Defends Israel DVD will help you do. Pick up your copy of this powerful DVD today.
Okay, so that gives you sort of an overview of the prophecy. Any questions so far? Just kidding. So listen, let's find ourselves on the prophetic timeline. We are between two very powerful marquee events of the end times. One of them is past, and it was the rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948. We're moving very rapidly toward the other second marquee event, which is the Gog and Magog war in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is, of course, the topic for tonight. The reason that's a marquee event is because that's the event that God has chosen in the latter days to put the world on official notice that He is the one true God. It says in Ezekiel 39, verse 7, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them profane my holy name anymore. And the nation shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. It requires a my people Israel, which are the chosen people of the Abrahamic covenant. He's going to uphold His unconditional covenant with Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant. And this particular event, Ezekiel 38, it also requires a land of Israel because He's going to prove He's the Holy One in Israel, the promised land, the chosen people, and the promised land. Therefore, we have those two facets of the Abrahamic covenant available today, the chosen people, Israel, in the promised land. So we are 74 years past the first event, the rebirth of the nation of Israel. We are marching closely to it in 2022, but we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. The stage is set. We talked about this. You saw it on the trailer. But there's a question mark there because I believe there's certain things that have to happen before Ezekiel 38 and 39. What are those things? Well, I talked about some of those things last night. I'll briefly scan a few of them tonight. But this focuses on Ezekiel 38 and 39. And when you look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, the golden rule of interpretation applies here because everything about this prophecy can be taken literally. And what that golden rule of interpretation is by Dr. David L. Cooper is when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. Therefore, take every word at its primary, ordinary, usual, literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate context studied in the light of related passages and axiomatic, self-evident, and unquestionable fundamental truths indicate clearly otherwise. So what that basically is saying is don't allegorize this prophecy, don't spiritualize this prophecy. When the plain sense makes common sense, read it literally as it says. We have to, when Ezekiel spoke, he had in the vocabulary of his time, he had territories and populations called Magog and Togarmah and Meshech, so we had to put a face on them, and we have to put modern day weapons in them instead of bows and arrows and things, but we have to look at this literally. It tells us everything about it. You're going to see that tells us who the invaders are, what their motive is, the conditions in Israel when an event happens, how it gets defeated, what happens in the aftermath. 52 verses of probably the most detailed prophecy in the whole Bible. Why? Because this is the event God has chosen to put the world on official notice, that He is God. So, we have 15 participants in the Ezekiel 38 prophecy. You have the victor, who is God. He stops this invasion supernaturally. The intended victim is Israel. The invaders are by their ancient names, Magog, Rosh, Meshech, Tubal. Persia will put a map up there so you see who they are today, their modern day equivalents. Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, and Togarmah. But there are some protesters barking from the sidelines. You have Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and their young lions. And tonight I'm going to provide the archaeological, biblical, historical, geographical, and geopolitical reasons why I believe the merchants of Tarshish are the UK, and one of the young lions is America. So if you want to find out the future of America, it looks like we can find out something from this prophecy. We certainly can find out the future of Russia from this prophecy, and Turkey from this prophecy, and Iran from this prophecy. But I think we can find out much more about our own country here. So the coalition, Magog, Togarmah, etc., the general consensus, you see up on the map there, and on the left side their names. You have Russia and the southern steppes of Russia. You'd have the stands, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan more than likely. Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and you'd give Morocco and Germany an honorable mention. Some people think they are also involved. It's interesting when you look on that list that Morocco and Sudan are in the Abraham Accords. At some point, they will invade Israel along with Russia. So the Abraham Accords will not last indefinitely, if you're familiar with the Abraham Accords. So they comprise, on another look here, an outer ring of countries. They don't share common borders with Israel. You see their ancient names superimposed on their modern-day countries. They've never been Israel's notorious enemies, but they will invade Israel for plunder and booty. We'll discover their motive momentarily. They're predominantly Muslim except for Russia. And we're going to compare this in contrast to an inner ring. I showed some of these maps last night, so some of you have seen them. And this is the Psalm 83 inner circle, but none of the belligerents in Ezekiel 38 are involved on the inner ring of countries. I'll talk about Psalm 83 just very briefly in the mid part of this to show you why I don't think Ezekiel 38 is quite ready to happen just yet. But there's an inner ring of countries, share common borders with Israel. They're in Psalm 83. There's an outer circle of countries in Ezekiel 38 that don't share common borders with Israel. So let's kind of look at what's going on in modern day time right now. Russia, Turkey, and Iran are involved in this prophecy. Their relationships nationally have never been stronger. They're solidifying year by year. Here they met in Sochi, Russia together in November of 2017, Ankara, Turkey in 2018, Tehran in September 2018, and again Sochi, Russia in February of this year. They're meeting together because they were all involved in the Syrian revolution. They have interests in Syria's normalization, coming back into independence. Bashar al-Assad of Syria has pretty much won that war at this point. The revolution has pretty much ceased. It's interesting that Barack Obama had allowed Vladimir Putin to move in hands-free into Syria, thinking he would sort of tone that whole revolution down, but what Vladimir Putin did instead was he bombed Bashar al-Assad's enemies to smithereens and helped Bashar al-Assad win that revolution. Russia also is deeply in bed with Iran because they're involved in building nuclear reactors in the west coast side of Iran. We talked about an Elam prophecy last night, and we also talked about how they, no matter what happens with this treaty that Iran's trying to make with the JCPOA, if it gets revived, if there's any sanctions to come out of this, Russia is unable to get $10 billion. So their relationship with Iran is not going away. They're solidified. And another clue that this prophecy is coming at us real quickly. Now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, which was just about 4 days after the Olympics in Beijing, which they were already, when the Olympics were going on, Russia was starting to mount its troops around the Ukraine. And it appeared many people were suspecting that they would invade Ukraine after the Olympics, and they sure did that about 4 days later. It was as if they had a gentleman, or should I say a communist dictatorship agreement between Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia. So pictures started surfacing of Hitler looking like Vladimir Putin. And it was showing up all over the place. Is Putin the next Hitler, so to speak? Russia invades Ukraine on multiple fronts in a brutal act of war. Now, there are some parallels I'm going to point out between what happens in Ezekiel 38 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia says they invaded Ukraine, and let me explain this. We're in the latter days. A Russian leader, which is what Gog and Magog, Gog is considered the Russian leader. Gog is the title of a leader. Magog would be up in Russia, in the area, around Moscow perhaps. And thoughts would come into his mind, an evil plan, an unprovoked attack on a country for plunder and booty. Now, Russia says they invaded because they didn't want NATO to come into the West and move closer to the Russian borders. But I believe he had ulterior motives because Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. It's the second largest in gas reserves, although most of those in Europe, although most of that is untapped. It's the fifth largest producer of corn in the world. Russia and Ukraine together account for the fourth largest producer of world's wheat. So, there's plunder and booty that could have been obtained as well, perhaps an ulterior motive. Trying to find some parallels here. So when we look at Ezekiel 38, we have a Russian leader in the latter days. Here's what it says in Ezekiel 38. It says, "Thus says the Lord God, on that day in the latter days, it shall come to pass the thoughts arise in your mind," being a Russian leader in the latter days, And you will make an evil plan. You will say, I will go up to a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people and who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. So we see a parallel there. A Russian leader going into a land with an evil plan to invade it, a peaceful people, which Ukraine was at the time. Why? To take great plunder and to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited and against the people gathered from the nations who acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land of Israel. So this is an invasion of Israel, not an invasion of Ukraine, of course. Now you see that I've put some pictures up here of Vladimir Putin, making him look like he's Gog. Now we don't know if he's Gog. He's, some people think he has cancer and maybe Parkinson's at this point, but he may not be Gog, or he could be, because it depends on how far we are down on the end times line. But I'm not saying that he's Gog. It could be someone's a successor who could even be worse. So I want to ask a question that I will answer at the end of this presentation. I wonder why Russia needs to form such a massive coalition to invade little tiny Israel, which is about the size of New Jersey. So you see the flashing red star up there, that's New Jersey. It would be almost like if Joe Biden was to say that for some reason we're going to invade New Jersey for plunder and gain. Well, we can't do it without Canada and Mexico and all the rest of the United States. That seems like overkill, correct? Because when Russia invaded Ukraine by himself, why do they need to come against little tiny Israel with such formidable troops? And we're talking a massive assortment of formidable troops. It says in Ezekiel 38:6, there'll be many people with you. And you see there's a list up there, active troops listed in 2020. They've got probably more now. There's 2.5 million worth of troops they could bring in this invasion, compared to Israel that's only got about 176,500. Seems like overkill, right? Why would they need that when they didn't need that to invade Ukraine? We'll address that after I'm done talking. So we have some very specific conditions that Israel must be residing in before this invasion can take place. And unless those conditions are met, this invasion can't take place. There can be no prerequisites. It has to be all in place. They have to be regathered from the nations in the latter years, brought back from the sword of persecution, Israel into the land of Israel, which had long been desolate. And we can give that a check mark. I'd say we've been seeing that going on for the last 74 years. But what about these? They must be a peaceful people, living in a land of unwalled villages, dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates, having silver and gold, and acquired livestock and goods, possessing booty and great plunder, because that's what Russia and their hordes are coming after. Their economies must be hurting. They're coming after what Israel has to fulfill and to help the livelihood of their economies. So we have to ask ourselves, is Israel dwelling in these conditions, peaceful, unwalled villages, securely without walls, bars, nor gates, and receipt of all this great plunder and booty? And I would suggest to you the answer to that is no. They're not living without walls, bars, nor gates in unwalled villages. Matter of fact, they have a 403-mile partition wall coursing right through the heart of Israel that separates Palestinian terror out from Israel proper. At some points, that's 20 feet high, filled with concrete. So they're not dwelling without walls, for certainly internally, but what about externally? This came out recently in 2018 in the Times of Israel. A 30-foot tall border wall goes up. The Israeli Defense Forces says Hezbollah and the Lebanese army are colluding. And here's what it's just a caption of the article. It says, the Israeli military this week publicly unveiled its 11-kilometer-long, 9-meter-tall concrete border wall along the Lebanese border. Now that would be 7 miles long and 29 feet high in, miles and feet. Now the concrete barrier is designed to serve two main functions: protect Israeli civilians and soldiers from sniper attacks and prevent infiltration into Israel by Hezbollah operatives. Now that's why they used to build walls in the old days, right? To protect against infiltration from invaders. And some of you might know that Hezbollah was building tunnels underneath those walls so they could launch a ground invasion, and Israel sniffed some of those out. Maybe not all of them. We'll have to see. That's not the only wall they're building to the north to protect themselves from Hezbollah. There's another one they built. Israel completes the border wall around Metula. That was in 2012. You see a picture of it there. So this is an extension of a different wall that we just said on the prior headline. Israel builds a new wall at the Lebanon southern border, but that's not all. Look at the headline on the bottom right. Israel starts a massive fence on the southern border with Jordan. They've even got a wall, a fence going on with Jordan. And they have a peace treaty with Jordan. But remember, 10 million people in Jordan, and 2.5 million of them are Palestinian refugees, and about 500,000 or more are actually Palestinians, including that 2.5 million. And they do not like Israel. They want a Palestinian state. Matter of fact, when you talk about walls, bars, or gates, the Middle East is the most fenced-in and fortified region in the world. You see some existing and proposed fences and walls going up there, and within all the countries in the Middle East, Israel is the most fenced-in and fortified. So I would check off, they're not dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates so far. Now, Ezekiel says they must be dwelling securely or safely. He says that 2 times in Ezekiel 38:8 and 38:11. And the Hebrew word is yeshav v'thak, dwelling securely. And what it alludes to is military security, a security that's established, not politically brokered, but militarily accomplished. They defeat their enemies. Now they can dwell securely. They can tear down the walls, bars, and gates. If you look at his other usages of the word. So if Israel is not dwelling securely right now without walls, bars, nor gates, when will they? What will have to happen as a prerequisite to accomplish that precondition? Well, Ezekiel actually tells us 10 chapters earlier. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 24 through 26, he says this: Thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and am hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. Now let's stop there for a minute. They have been getting gathered into their own land, and accomplishment of that first paragraph there. And it says, and then they will dwell safely, they will build houses and plant vineyards, yes, they will dwell securely. When I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God. It's the same word, yeshav v'tak, used twice in Ezekiel 28 here, just like it was used twice in Ezekiel 38. They can't dwell safely until judgments are executed upon those around them who despise them. So we have to ask ourselves, those people around Israel who despise them, who will have judgments executed upon them to enable them to dwell safely, yeshav v'tak. If you're here last night, I told you there were, and it's this inner circle of Psalm 83. Israel's notorious enemies, they fought against Israel in 1948, 1967, 1973, and there's been other conflicts also. So they're not dwelling securely until that situation enables them to judgments executed upon those around them who despise them. Okay, so we talked about who the Magog Confederates were, but let's talk about these protesters that seem to be barking from the sidelines. They're not fighting with Israel, on behalf of Israel, but they're not invading Israel. They're just spectators apparently on the sidelines that are very concerned about what's this invasion, the motive of the invasion, and the invasion itself. And so we're told in Ezekiel 38:13 about these protesters. It says, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away gold, to take away great plunder? And so we look there and you see there's a couple arrows down on the bottom. Sheba would be Yemen. That's down where the Houthis are down there. Dedan would be Saudi Arabia. And it could include also the Gulf states over there, UAE, Bahrain. Some people extrapolate it all the way over to the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman. But where is Tarshish? Okay, it's pretty easy to determine who Dedan and Sheba is, but where is Tarshish? Remember, it says the merchants of Tarshish too. Keep that in mind, not the politicians, not the athletes, not the entertainers. Well, there's 2 trains of thought predominantly as to who Tarshish is, and that would be Spain is one of the trains of thought. They say it would be Tartessus, which was in Greek mythical writings. It's very unclear whether it was even a city, a river, or a nation. But they would say the young lions or the young villages would be the Latino countries, South America, and things like that. I've looked at those arguments. I have discounted them. Tartessus is really mainly Greek mythologically. But you'll see for the other reasons I put forward that it sort of, the evidence starts going heavily into the side of the UK as merchants of Tarshish. But like I said, the bottom line is so the other theory is the UK. And from the UK, you had young lions came out, you had North America, Canada, America, Australia, etc. The merchants of Tarshish is the theme. It appears to be these protesters, whoever they are, as we try to put a face on them, they're concerned about this invasion because they have commercial interests at stake with Israel. You know, right now, I had lunch today with John and Eric Stakelback, and a headline came out that said, Europe is asking Israel to export natural gas to Europe because in the Ukraine, the sanctions that Europe put on with the Russia's invasion, Russia was sending a lot of gas into Europe. With the sanctions now, they're not getting all that gas. So they've asked Israel, who's wealthy in gas, to start exporting it to them. They came and personally approached the Europeans, approached Israel last month to do this, and this is already starting to happen now. So let's look now biblically and historically and geographically at Tarshish. We have a lot of scriptures dealing with Tarshish that tells us a lot of clues, so we can try to find out the location of this place. Who is Tarshish? We're told in Genesis 10, verses 4 through 5. The sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim, these were the isles of the Gentiles, the islands of the Gentiles, divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, and their families in their nations. The isles of Tarshish show up at least 4 times more in the Bible. So they're clearly, geographically, isles. Now, the UK, I have a picture of the British Isles. Islands of Great Britain, Ireland, the Isle of Man. There's 6,000 smaller isles. There's about 136 permanently inhabited isles, whereas Spain is not really known for its islands. It's connected to the continent of Europe. So there's one clue. Where is Tarshish? So we know there are isles, but where are these isles? Well, we have a clue when Jonah was asked by God to go warn the Assyrians that judgment was coming. And you know the story, Jonah got on a ship at Joppa, went down to Joppa. He found a ship going to Tarshish, which is entirely the opposite direction of where he's supposed to be going. And of course, God got him to do his commission by getting him swallowed up by a whale. So I won't go into the whole biblical story. I'm sure you've been taught that in Sunday school. So he paid the fare and there went into them to Tarshish in the presence of the Lord, showing he's going, hightailing it as far as he can to the west of Israel. We have a psalm that says, Thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. So Tarshish would be coming from the west, an east wind would break their sail. Okay, so the islands we're talking about are far to the west so far. Now, some archaeologists say that, matter of fact, I'll give you a quote from Mark Hitchcock, but they say it's beyond the Gibraltar. So you see the Strait of Gibraltar there's between Spain and Morocco, and you come up around that, you got the British Isles. I've got it highlighted there. Dr. Mark Hitchcock, a Bible prophecy scholar, says this in his book, The Late Great United States. Some archaeologists believe that Tarshish was the ancient name of Britain. Tarshish can also mean beyond Gibraltar, depending on your translation. Tarshish and her villages are young lions, in other words, Britain, which then settled Canada and the United States and Australia. Okay, so the definition of beyond the Gibraltar. Okay, so we're finding more far to the west, the islands far to the west, the Isles of the Gentiles. But what is Tarshish known for? Tarshish, here's a quote in Ezekiel 27:12. Remember, the theme we're dealing with here is the merchants of Tarshish, so we get a clue here. Historically, Tarshish was talking about Tyre and Lebanon, merchant by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches. These islands were rich. Rich with what? With silver, iron, tin, and lead. They traded in thy fairs. 7 other times you see the merchants and riches connected with Tarshish. So they were rich in minerals that came over to the Middle East. They also were known for their strong seaworthy ships that could travel long distances throughout inclement conditions, carrying these fine precious metals and other wares. The ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market, and thou wast replenished and made very glorious in the midst of the seas. Ezekiel 27:25. Seaworthy ships filled with silver, iron, tin, and lead. And I write in the Now Prophecies book, about 587 BC, Ezekiel acknowledged that tin was among the primary metals that came from Tarshish. Cornwall, a county on England's rugged southwestern tip, was the only major source of tin in Europe for the past 2,500 years. It is also true that the mountains of Wales, just north of Cornwall, have been a source of all the minerals and metals listed above in Ezekiel 27:12. There was a study done in 2019 by Heidelberg University entitled The Enigma of Bronze Age Tin, reinforcing what I had just read to you. They examined Bronze Age tin from the 2nd millennium BC from Israel, Turkey, and Greece. And they concluded the tin artifacts from Israel, for example, largely matched tin from Cornwall and Devon, which is in Great Britain. So we had a study done just a few years back that evidences that. J.R. Church, who has founded Prophecy in the News, who has since went on to be with the Lord, wrote in his book, The Guardians of the Grail, an inscription discovered in 1780 on a cliff above Mount Hope Bay in Bristol, Rhode Island, contained an engraving that read, "Voyagers from Tarshish, this stone proclaims." It's believed to be inscribed around 533 BC. Harvard University has found 5 locations within the United States where the merchants of Tarshish had colonies. So archaeologically, geographically, biblically, historically, so far we're really putting the pendulum swinging over here toward the UK and not Spain, right? As Tarshish. Let's look at geopolitically in modern times. Since we just looked at the other aspects, there was a time at a zenith by 1922, the empire on which the British Empire was known as the empire on which the sun never set. You see the map up there, all the red areas. The sun would rise in the east and set on the west. So the sun would never really set in the British Empire. They had sovereignty over 458 million people, which was about a fifth of the world's population. 13 million square miles, almost a fourth of the earth. That's what they had. Here's a banner from World War I when the British fought in World War I against the Ottoman Empire and the Germans, along with the French, etc. And this is a banner for World War I, and it says, World War I, Young Lions, Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, enlist with the old lion. So they were calling them Young Lions, their colonies from Tarshish, and them being the old lion. Now, of course, you'd say, well, where's America? And America had broken away in 1776. This prophecy was written about 2,600 years ago, before America became independent. Now, geopolitically, let's look at that the perspective. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. They had controlled the Middle East for 400 years, from 1517 to 1917. And you see that who took control was France, took over the Syria, Lebanon area, and England, what's called Tarshish, took over, it was Israel today, Jordan today, parts of Saudi Arabia, much of Iraq. And then what happened was, over time, in the 1900s, these Arabs started getting their states as the UK started and France started to relinquish their control over these areas. Egypt 1922 got its statehood, Saudi Arabia and Iraq 1932. You see the list up there, Iran 1935. Now Iran used to be called Persia. In 1935 they renamed it to Iran. Lebanon 1943, Syria and Jordan 1946, and then Israel 1948. So we see that the merchants of Tarshish being the UK, was instrumental in modern times in the Middle East area. Well, what we don't see is anything dealing with Spain, right? There's no Spain in there, so another check mark against Spain as being Tarshish. Now, at that time, after World War I, the UK came out with the Balfour Declaration, which was supposed to give the Jewish people the land of Israel, and actually what is modern-day Jordan. It was called Transjordan at that time. But the Arabs who got their statehood were agonizing, saying, don't give it, we helped you win the war against the Ottoman Empire. Don't give Israel a statehood. So they convinced the UK not to act upon sovereignly what they were supposed to do. And there was a San Remo conference, which was legal rights to give Israel their land. That was shortly after the Balfour Declaration. But they didn't do what they were supposed to do, and I believe God punished them for that, because they subjected the Jews, who should have had a homeland, to 6 million Jews to be exterminated by Hitler. So now we find that the sun always sets on the British Empire. From 1922 to 1990, they, at this point, are just 94,000 square miles with about 66 million people. The sun always sets on the British Empire now. Now, while they were declining over those 70 so years, there was this upstart country that was becoming a very ferocious young lion. It was called America. And who do we see involved in the Middle East more so than any other country right now? And that would be America. We see that we brokered a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, Jimmy Carter in 1979. Bill Clinton brokered a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in 1994. But we have to ask ourselves the question, okay, so we've looked geographically, biblically, historically, archaeologically, now geopolitically. It does look pretty convincing that we can find ourselves in this prophecy, but how do we find ourselves? We find ourselves barking from the sidelines as a cowardly young lion, not helping Israel. You can understand why the UK wouldn't fight against Russia and all this formidable alliance, but America is still the #1 superpower. What happens to us? Are we on a decline like the UK? Will the sun set on this empire? Well, the USA has been in the danger zone for 60 years, since 1962. I'm going to show you a few Supreme Court decisions when we gave God his walking papers. We said, we don't need you anymore. We don't need our children to learn about you in the schools or pray about you. 1962, when John F. Kennedy was president, Engel versus Vitale, Supreme Court decision, removal of prayer in public schools. The next year, Abington School District versus Shemp, removal of Bible reading in public schools. John F. Kennedy was assassinated 5 months later in November. I'm not saying that's why. I'm just making an observation. Then Richard Nixon was around when the Roe versus Wade with legalized abortions. Now, Jeremiah tells us that you knew my days before I was even in the womb. And God told Adam and Noah that, I want you to multiply on the earth and raise godly offspring. Presently, we've deprived over 60 million babies of that opportunity. He was impeached shortly thereafter. Just making an observation. And then there were some other localized state things, Stone versus Graham. That was actually a federal Supreme Court. 10 Commandments moved out of the classrooms. Texas state law, Lawrence versus Texas, when George Bush was the president. Struck down sodomy laws which affected extensions and validated sodomy laws in 13 other states. And we had some other really big Supreme Court decisions when Barack Obama was president. United States versus Windsor in 2013 struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA. They couldn't defend the constitutionality of one man being married to one woman. When you can't defend the biblical model of marriage, then you can redefine marriage, and that happened in 2015. Oberfeld versus Hodges' approval of same-sex marriages. And at the same time around there, Barack Obama, his administration got themselves involved in the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal with a terrorist nation that wants to wipe Israel off the map. So we're in the danger zone where I believe our superpower status is going to wane quickly. I see it already happening. The president currently on staff, the administration wants to go global. So anything's possible. We wake up every morning and have to wonder what's next, right? So, while John and I were at the East Coast Calvary Chapel Pastors Conference on Tuesday with 2,500 pastors from the East Coast, very anointed men, it was such a beautiful experience, praise and worship. I'm so blessed to be there as a guest. We got out to only find out that Robb Elementary School shooting had happened. 19 students and 2 adults had been killed. So, it's a crazy country at this point in time, and God's hedge of protection has We're going through what's called abandonment wrath in Romans 1, where God takes down his hedge of protection. You know, I was going to a movie a few years back with my son's father-in-law, and they were watching a 12-year-old kid for their neighbor. And the 12-year-old kid said, "Hey, Bill, you're going to the movies." He goes, "You know, me and my dad, when we go, we always sit in the back, very far back." And I said, "Well, why is that?" He goes, "Because we don't want to get shot. We're concerned when we go to the theater, we might get shot." 12-year-old kid, this is like 3 or 4 years ago. Is there anywhere safe in America? State buildings, Alfred P. Murrah, Timothy McVeigh, 1995, 168 killed. High schools, Columbine. Universities have been struck, military installations, supermarkets, shopping malls, concerts in Las Vegas, country western concert, you probably remember that gory thing, movie theaters, churches, etc. So our current president had this to say about the recent shooting.
Mass shootings rarely happen anywhere else in the world. Why? They have mental health problems. They have domestic disputes in other countries. They have people who are lost. But these kinds of mass shootings never happen with the kind of frequency they happen in America. Why? Why are we willing to live with this carnage? It's time for those who obstruct or delay or block the common sense gun laws. We need to let you know that we will not forget.
So you just answered why. We need to take away all of your guns. So let's defund the police and take away the guns, right? No, I say let's fund the police and put some cops in front of the schools.
Amen.
So look for more of a push in that direction of gun control. How can America decline to be a cowardly young lion on the sidelines? Possible scenarios: international or domestic terrorism, economic collapse perhaps. What about an EMP, electromagnetic pulse atomic weapon? This is a nuclear weapon, and the EMP is, that it's launched up miles above the Earth over an area, and when it's bursts altitude, it shoots out like the speed of light, like a canopy, and fries everything underneath it. So for instance, the burst altitude of 30 miles would take out that much of America. You take it up a little higher, you could take out Canada, all of America. Now, that's a nuclear weapon. China's got them, Russia's got them, North Korea's got them. People who don't really like us. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but, you know, it's a realm of possibility. What about the rapture? What if you took out, we don't know how many millions of Americans, some people say it's 30, 40, 50 million Americans. How would the societal functions would collapse? There'd be some political leaders that would go away, military leaders, military soldiers, etc. All your societal aspects would be concerned. So, and I'm looking for that, to be honest with you. The rapture could happen. And who's going to be left behind? I'm not going to get political on you, but, you know, all the liberals, globalists, anti-biblical, pro-abortion, pro-homosexual, they get to have what they want. So let's go back to Ezekiel 38 now that I think we've got a pretty good pulse on who the merchants of Tarshish and their young lions are. This is too formidable of an advance for the Israeli Defense Forces, and we just ruled out America helping out. So God's going to take the helm here, and supernaturally he's going to stop this invasion with a great earthquake. Every man's sword is going to be against his brother. So this great earthquake is going to panic these invaders who are speaking different languages. You know, they don't all speak the same language. Turkey doesn't speak Farsi, right? So they're going to start killing each other, panicking from the earthquake. There'll be pestilence and bloodshed, flooding rains, great hailstones, and fire and brimstone. And then imagine this happening. So we've been watching Ukraine, right? We've still been watching the TV, seeing Russia moved in there. But imagine there's reporters on the ground. They see the Russian troops with their hordes coming, it says, from the uttermost parts of the north. They're starting to mobilize. They're getting ready to come and invade Israel. Merchants of Tarshish and young lions and Sheba and Dan are going, "What are you doing, Russia? You coming for our commercial interests in Israel? We got contracts with them that we need to, you know, our economies need what they got, right? What are you doing, Russia?" And here comes Russia coming down. Now it's clear to us they're going to invade. You got the CNN reporters, the Fox reporters going, oh, now we get it. Oh my goodness. So they're starting to come down to the north, and all of a sudden there's a great earthquake. And they don't get to make their attack on the mountains of Israel. And they're killing each other, and there's pestilence flying down, and there's flooding rains. It's going to be pretty clear to most people that was the God of the Jews that stopped that. So that's when he says, I read this earlier to you, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. I will not let them profane my holy name anymore. Then the nation shall know that I'm the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. Now, it says the nation shall know I'm the Lord. They will know that was supernatural, you know. There won't be a salvation knowledge. They'll just come to recognition that was God. So what happens in the aftermath? The Israelis will burn the weapons for 7 years, convert them to fuel. I'll get into that in a second. Weapons for fuel. This is what it says, Ezekiel 39, verses 9 and 10a. Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, the small and large shields and bows and arrows, the war clubs and spears. For 7 years they will use them for fuel. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut it from the forest, because they will use the weapons for fuel. Now Ezekiel's talking about bows and arrows and war clubs and stuff, because he didn't have nuclear weapons and technologies that they could use and convert to fuel right now. They would burn wood and things for fuel for heating and cooking and energy purposes, right? So I think he's clearly talking, and there wouldn't be enough bows and arrows to burn for 7 years, right? And Russia's not going to leave their best weapons on the shelf. They'll probably be bringing their ABCs, atomic, biological, and chemical weapons with their group. You might find it interesting to know that the technology to convert nuclear weapons into energy already exists today, and America's employed it for quite some time. Here's some headlines. Megatons to megawatts, Russian warheads fuel used for U.S. power plants. New York Times reported in 2009, power for U.S. from Russia's old nuclear weapons. Remember, the Soviet Union disbanded. So the nuclear weapons, somehow we've been using some of those for nuclear, and it says Russian nuclear warheads provided electricity for the U.S. for 20 years. So that technology already exists. And Russia and Israel, if it doesn't already know how to have that technology, they will know at that time. Now one of the reasons why, there's two reasons why I believe this is a pre-tribulation event, Ezekiel 38. The first reason, not necessarily the stronger reason, but as I said, God's going to let the world know He's a covenant-keeping God. His holy name is going to be made known. And I think He's going to do that before the tribulation, because in the tribulation, the Antichrist will start to come on the scene, and ultimately, the mid part of the tribulation, He's going to force people to worship Him. It'll be a very popular choice, very deceptive. There'll be signs and lying wonders. And I don't think God's going to go at the mid part of the tribulation when the Antichrist is give people the mark of the beast, or get in the mark of the beast and go, oy vey, I wish I would have done this sooner. He didn't really do oy vey. That's sort of a Jewish thing. That I do that kind of wakes me up. The other reason I believe it's a pre-tribulation event, and a lot of scholars, Ron Rhodes, Dr. Ronald Fruchtenbaum, and others adhere to this thought, that you could burn weapons for the first 3.5 years. When you understand the tribulation period, it's compartmentalized into a first half of 3.5 years and a second half of 3.5 years. And the first half of 3.5 years, Israel's living in a condition of peace, because they've had a covenant confirmed by the Antichrist. And it's a pseudo-peace because it gets broken in the middle part, false peace. But they could burn weapons for 3.5 years and convert them to fuel. But in the second half, they won't be doing that, because they'll be fleeing from the Antichrist, because we're told that the Antichrist will try to commit genocide of the Jewish people, and it says 2/3 of the Jews will be killed in the land. 1/3 will be a faithful remnant who comes out. So they're going to be fleeing for their lives. If anything, they'll grab a weapon to use it to get to where they're going. So you could burn weapons 3.5 years before the tribulation. You could bury 3.5 years into the first half of the tribulation. But at the mid part of the tribulation, you're not going to be converting to fuel. And it's clearly talking about the people in the cities of Israel are doing this, not anybody else, not the Antichrist or anything like that. So I think we have a pre-tribulation event. I personally think the church will be raptured prior to this event, but I don't know. You know, this is very Israel. 3 times in Ezekiel 38 and 39, he talks about my people Israel. It talks about also them cleansing the land several times, which is a ritual requirement of the law. So the way Israel will respond to this is they're going to want to build their temple and start doing sacrifices and offerings and stuff like that. They'll realize God defended them on a large scale. Then it goes on to give us even some more details. So many details in Ezekiel 38 and 39. They're going to bury the dead in a valley called Hamongog. They're going to bury them for 7 months. And we're told that they're going to bury them in a valley east of some sea that will obstruct travelers. So we'll look at what sea they could be talking about. And when they're converting the weapons to fuel and burying these hordes of Gog, Hamongog means hordes of Gog, the invaders, they're dead. Israel gains world renown. You know, their God just stopped the most massive armed and dangerous invasion in the Middle East, and they're converting weapons to fuel with great technology, not cutting down trees, planting trees. And they bring the dead for 7 months in some valley. Well, we'll look at a location of that valley in a moment. But it goes on to say, they will set men apart, regularly employed, with the help of a search party to pass through the land and bury the bodies remaining on the ground in order to cleanse it. Of course, they're going to be contaminated, right? At the end of the 7 months, they'll make a search. The search party will pass through the land. When anyone sees a man's bone, he will set up a marker by it till the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamongog, which doesn't exist right now. It will exist when it has to exist. And I'll tell you why I think it's going to be in Jordan in a minute. But this sounds like a hazmat operation, right? So the sea, east of some sea in a valley that will obstruct travelers. Well, east of the Mediterranean Sea is Israel proper, and I don't think they're going to bury all these dead soldiers contaminated in Israel proper. Then your other candidate is Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and a lot of mountains over in that area. That's where Syria is. Not necessarily a likely candidate for that. They could try to deport all these dead bodies down to the Red Sea, which would take them down to Saudi Arabia, east of the Red Sea. Not likely. Saudi Arabia wouldn't allow that, nor would they really want to run them all through Israel proper down there. So the next candidate would be the Dead Sea. East of the Dead Sea is a perfect place. That's central Jordan, desert valley, wasteland. No one's really taking tours over there. And Israel's going to have possession of Jordan, in my estimation, by this time. I went through this last night. I'll show one prophecy. Israel's going to annex Jordan before Ezekiel 38 and 39, in my estimation. It says, I heard the reproach of Moab and the insults of Ammon, that's central Jordan, Moab, northern Jordan, Ammon, which they made reproach against my people, arrogant threats against their borders. Here's what's going to happen for that. The residue of my people, the Israeli defense forces, shall plunder them, and the remnant of my people, the Israelis, shall possess them. They're going to move into that territory. So I believe the valley of Hamongog is actually going to be east of the Dead Sea in Jordan, which if Israel takes over Jordan before the tribulation, that's really good news, because Jesus made a comment in Matthew 24. He said to the Jewish people that when you see the abomination of desolation, when the Antichrist goes in the middle part of the tribulation and sets up, does the abomination, which some people think is the image of the beast, spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Now notice that whoever reads, let him understand. It's not a suggestion, it's a command. Those Jews need to understand that. We need to understand that. If we're reading it, we need to understand it too. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and was suggested from other scriptures, the mountains he's talking about is the mountains in southern Jordan. Now, if Israel has possession of southern Jordan and Jordan in general, that's really great news, because there's a place called Petra. It's a rock cave fortress. They could seek refuge there. But if they don't have possession of Jordan, this is terrible advice, because Jordanians are not going to let several million Jews come tromping across to get over there. So, and Christ anticipated the annexation of Jordan when he said that, in my estimation. Another clue that this prophecy is about to find fulfillment is, we're told in Ezekiel 39:17, speak to every sort of bird and to every beast of the field, assemble yourselves and come, gather together on all sides for my sacrificial meal, which I am sacrificing for you, a great sacrificial meal on the mountains of Israel, that you may eat flesh and drink the blood. So God is saying to the birds every sort of vulture bird, every bird, and every beast to assemble themselves for the great feast of the hordes of Gog. Now, a bird can't come to a feast, sacrificial meal, in Israel if they're in Canada or if they're in America. It would take too long to fly there, right? Well, the good news is they're already there. So here's a few headlines. It's an amazing phenomena. These birds are already there getting ready for the sacrificial meal, which makes us wonder, how close is this event really about to happen? The stage is really getting set. So here's the headline. Times of Israel, 2019. The Egyptian vultures returned to Carmel Mountains after 60 years. Times of Israel, May of 21. Vultures thought extinct from Israel for 30 years, spotted twice in a month. That was back 21. Jerusalem Post, 2017. Israeli vulture population is on the rise. 2007. The Iraqi birds that made Aliyah. They came from Iraq. Times of Israel, 2016. While Israel is the pilgrimage site for birds. And 2017, Israel's 500 million birds, the world's eighth wonder. So we're getting close on this prophecy. But like I said, they have to be dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates. They can't dwell securely because the people around them who despise them need judgments executed upon them. So that's Ezekiel 38. It's stage set for happen. You see those belligerents. We saw this map earlier. It's going to happen, and God's going to stop it. And Islam's going to be hurt big time because there's a lot of Muslims there. I think preceding that is Psalm 83, which are Muslim countries that need judgments executed upon them. They are around them and they despise them. I talked about that last night for the young adults that weren't here. So I think what's going to happen is after Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38, Allah is going to lose his Akbar. Now, what happens when a terrorist, in the name of his God Allah, goes to do a terrorist act, he starts shouting, Allahu Akbar. Our God is the greatest God. Well, that's just not the case, right? And Allah and Jehovah are not the same God. So after Psalm 83, it'll be a punch to the gut of Islam. Ezekiel 38, an uppercut to the jawbone of Islam. The tribulation period knocks Islam out for the 10 count. Now, there's about 600 million to 800 million core Muslims in these lands, these countries. Islam's got about 1.6 billion. But these are the core people. And these 600, 800 million need to be killed, exiled, or prisoners of war. It's going to put a big dent into Islam. And many Muslims are going to start wondering, where was Allah? How come the little Jews who don't like their God out, took out our people? So there's different, these are two different prophecies. Psalm 83, it involves the Arabs versus the Jews. Ezekiel 38 involves mostly non-Arabs versus Jews. Inner circle of countries, different enemies versus an outer ring. The motives are different. They take the land. Psalm 83, they want the pastures of God for their possession. Ezekiel 38, they want to take the booty and the plunder, different motive. Different defeats. Israeli Defense Forces, I pointed this out last night, defeat their enemies around them, or as the Lord supernaturally has to step up to defend Israel against the massive invasion of Russia. And the different results is that it will end the ancient hatred of the Arabs and the Jews once and for all. In Psalm 83, but Ezekiel 38, God will make his holy name known to the nations of the world and to Israel, that he's the Holy One in Israel. So let's answer that question with all this in mind. Why does Russia need to form such a massive coalition to take out New Jersey? Because Israel is about the size of New Jersey. So let's just say, and I'm using the word Biden, he's the president. Let's just say he says, let's try to, the Bible Belt says, hey, listen, we don't need any help. We can take out this New Jersey. Now, imagine New Jersey being Israel has just won the Psalm 83 war, right? Now they're expanding territorially into Jordan, and they're taking, and the word for plunder and booty is shalal, that's spoil from the despoil, so they're also getting plunder and booty. annexing land. They'll probably have their own natural gas, probably discover oil by then. They're going to be a very wealthy nation. Their God will have stopped Russia. So all of a sudden they say, we'll take out New Jersey, and they lose. And New Jersey moves over and starts annexing land, taking over the police departments and nuclear arsenals and stuff like that. Now, do you think they would need a little more support? Okay? Well, ultimately, Israel will expand. They will expand into all the land God gave Abraham in Genesis 15:18, from the river of Egypt to the river Nile, the river Euphrates, which is in Syria and Iraq. When Jesus comes, he will give them all that land. But as my contention is that they will annex some territory, probably this much area after Psalm 83, and expand territorially. So we're going to see a lot of things geopolitically shifting. We may not be here to see all. We'll probably see some of the annexation if we're here for Psalm 83, but we won't see the Russian invasion unless we're still here. Psalm 83 is pre-trib, Ezekiel 38 is pre-trib, the rapture is pre-trib. Psalm 83, the rapture could happen before, during, and after Psalm 83, or before, during, and after Ezekiel 38. But they're all three, in my estimation, pre-tribulation events. I showed why the Israel Defense Forces fighting the Arabs, it has to be pre-trib, because they're not fighting in the tribulation period. Annexing territory, Israel has a history of doing this. I talked about this last night, but for the young adults, when they win wars, Joshua did it 3,500 years ago. They annex territory. It increases the defensibility of their borders. It's land within the promised land. They feel justified that that's their land. King David and King Solomon did it 3,000 years ago. The Israeli Defense Forces did it in 1967 when they won a war. They took over Jerusalem, almost tripled their size. And they're going to, in my estimation, do it again once the Israeli Defense Forces execute judgments around those who despise them. That will be the tool God uses so that Israel can dwell securely. I write quite a bit about what I'm going to tell you tonight in this next 10 short minutes, Reader Digest version, in my Final Prophecies book out there. But we're trying to get to Q&A, but I wanted for the young adults to know kind of what's coming on. They're the ones who are going to be most familiar with this. And mass adoption may be very soon for even some of you not so young adults. So, is the coronavirus killing off cash? This was in April. Political article. Tech firms seeing the opportunity they've been waiting for as shoppers and business recoil from paper money. Who's hurt when legal tender goes away? Cash can carry viruses. It costs money to mint. It can be laundered. It can be hidden. So, and it's hard to get truth for income taxes and things like that. There's a time coming in the middle of the tribulation where no one will buy or sell except they have a mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. And that's going to be a cashless economy. And I'm going to read a little more about that in a minute. But here's a few headlines we're going to rifle through. Talking about cryptocurrencies, the International Monetary Fund publishes a cryptocurrency. Now you're going to notice most of these articles are during the coronavirus period. This thing just started getting accelerated by the concerns about cash. Cryptocurrency explainer saying it could be the next step in the evolution of money. That's Bitcoin.com. MasterCard and Visa are making bold moves toward mass crypto adoption. I told you last night that MasterCard has already got a technology where you can buy with your, I might have a slide on that, with your Face ID in the palm of your hand. That's operating in Brazil and maybe operating in the U.S. very soon. The race to get the first cryptocurrency was the Bitcoin, right? But central banks couldn't control it, so they have a concern about that. They can't monitor it, and so now there's a race. Like it's who's going to get to the moon first? Who's going to get the better Bitcoin? What countries have come up with it? There are a total of 87 countries that are exploring issuing a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, meaning their central bank. They're federal banks. That was as of March 22, which is up from 35 countries in 2020. So they're racing ahead. You see some of the countries, the big names that are coming up with it: UK, USA, Canada, Australia, EU, China, South Korea, Japan, India, Pakistan, Russia, Mexico. 9 countries have already implemented the CBDCs. The United States has already got ready to roll out with a plan. Fed Chairman Powell says Fed report on crypto and central bank digital currency is ready to go. That was in January of this year. So it's already coming to the shores of America. Well, what is this cryptocurrency for those who aren't familiar with it? It's a digital currency in which encryption techniques are used to regulate generation of units of currency and verify the transfer of funds operating independently of a central bank. That's why the central banks want to get control of it. This means that it is decentralized, which is very problematic for central banks of countries to own their own nation's money supply. I read about that in the Final Prophecies. That's my quote. Here's a few more headlines. China rolls out a pilot test of digital currency in April 2020. Cointelegraph. Sweden is testing its new central bank digital currency. They've already been testing it. Here's a little video that the International Monetary Fund put out on cryptocurrencies. Can I get some volume?
When we buy or sell things, the payment is usually processed by a bank or credit card company. Problem number 1, the companies often take a cut of the transaction. 2, we have to trust these companies to protect our sensitive data from hackers. 3, most international payments take a long time and are expensive. To solve these problems, we could use a special currency that is secure and based on the science of cryptography, which is a way of protecting information using mathematics. This special type of currency is called a cryptocurrency and only exists in computer networks. When you send someone this special currency, the money goes directly to them, removing the middleman. And at the same time, the transaction is broadcast to the entire network and recorded in a permanent way, which means it's almost impossible to fool the system. Costs of making payments are lower, transactions are faster, especially across countries, and even those people around the globe who don't have bank accounts can buy or sell goods and participate in the global economy. However, there are some risks. The transactions in most cryptocurrencies are anonymous. Some cryptocurrencies can even be untraceable. This can make it easier for the bad guys to make payments without being noticed. If you lose your password, you could lose all your money. At the moment, cryptocurrencies are highly volatile. They can't process large amounts of transactions quickly yet, and they're not even widely accepted. But if we can counter the risks, then this new technology, or some variation of it, can completely change the way we sell, buy, save, invest, and pay our bills. And who knows, this could be the next step in the evolution of money.
That was I think a couple years ago that came out. So she said not widely accepted. There's some concerns, right? Well, it's becoming more widely accepted rapidly. So cryptocurrency works through a blockchain technology. And here's some headlines. Why blockchain could be your next form of ID as a world citizen. ID is the key for accessing education, healthcare, voting, banking, housing, and other family benefits for all citizens worldwide. The Bank of Canada is exploring digital currencies back in 2019 that would replace cash, track how people spend money, so they can track consumer behavior. And they can know how much money you made, so they can get their income taxes. The Swedes are getting implants in their hands to replace cash and credit cards. That's already happened. So what is blockchain technology? Blockchain is an electronic monitoring system in which a record of transactions made in cryptocurrencies are maintained across several linked computers in a network, not just one, but on a global basis. The block represents the digital information about a transaction, such as the products, participants, the date, the location, the dollar amount, all the details. The chain is the public database where the block information gets stored. I read about that in the Final Prophecies. So remember the old style cash register. Digital dollars don't fit into a leather wallet. And when you make a transaction, you'd have the receipt and sometimes the product bought and all that, the old cash register. Well, that's now giving way to this new technology, which is much more thoroughly comprehensive, records of everything. So this technology is going to be developed, it looks like, by the nations. They're going to have their own cryptocurrency. Some of them may use a common one. But at some point in time, the Antichrist is going to have a cashless society that will probably use cryptocurrencies, and no one will be able to buy or sell unless they have this technology implanted somehow in them. Now that doesn't happen until the midpoint of the tribulation, but meanwhile we're seeing the technology rapidly advancing among the nations. So when we get to the middle part of the tribulation, and we won't be here for the tribulation, if you believe in Jesus Christ. I say we corporately. I'm hoping you all believe in Jesus Christ. If you don't see John or me after the meeting, we won't scold you. There's going to be a war in heaven, and Satan and a third of the fallen angels will get cast down to the earth. That's in the mid part of the tribulation. And when he comes down, there's going to be his point man, the Antichrist, is going to have received a mortal head wound, and he will resurrect him. Now some people think, because it seems to be a true resurrection. Now Jesus Christ says, I am the resurrection, right? But the words are the same. It looks like a true resurrection, the Greek words. But some of us suspect that it's an alteration of DNA. It's some sort of weird thing, right? And then he will pick up a hitchhiker on his campaign at the midpoint of the trib called the false prophet, who will implement the image and the mark of the beast. And here's what it says about that. I saw one of his heads of the Antichrist had been mortally wounded. The deadly wound was healed. And when that happens, the whole world marvels and follows the beast. So when they see this guy, this charismatic world leader, rise from the dead, they start following him and marveling. So they worship the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him. And he picks up this hitchhiker, the false prophet, who, Revelation 13 tells us, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, the Antichrist, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. If you don't worship it, you'll be killed. He causes all, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. For it is the number of the man. His number is 666. I'm sure that'll be one of the questions that we ask. What does that mean, right? So in the summary, false prophet, he performs signs, deceives all those on the earth. Remember, this deception is going to cause people to be standing in line for this mark of the beast. Instructs people to make an image to the beast. He gives breath to the image. Supernatural type scenario. Enables it to speak and causes many who does not worship the image to be killed. So, it's like, do you want to be killed? Everything's looking pretty deceptive and wonderful. Why would I want to be killed, right? He causes everyone to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. So it makes no one may buy or sell unless they have the mark. Now, folks, if we're as deep on the end times line as we think we are, who thinks we're in the end times? Who thinks we're kind of like deep into the end times? Okay. Meaning we probably have loved ones, people we cherish, who are not saved, that may face this sort of a thing. So we need to be really aware of that. That's why some people say, well, I don't care about this stuff. I won't be here. I'm going to get raptured. I'll be out of here. And I say, well, do you have someone you know that ain't going to be raptured, that you love? And then every hand goes up. Let's just do that. Do you have someone you love or know, cherish? Okay. That's why you care. MasterCard launches the tech that lets you pay with your face or your hand in stores. I told you about that. That's as of May 17th. That just came out. Presently, the World Health Organization they're meeting in Davos, World Economic Forum, and this is what they've come up with, one of the headlines: World Health Organization, the Global Pandemic Treaty includes a plan for mandatory universal digital passport and ID systems. See, this can all fit into the blockchain technology, into the crypto. All of it can be stored into this system. It's all digital. The WHO, World Health Organization, plans to finalize the treaty by 2024. It will aim to shift governing authority now reserved to sovereign states to the World Health Organization during a pandemic by legally binding member states to the World Health Organization's revised international health regulations. There's 194 member states of the World Health Organization. In January of this year, the Biden administration submitted a proposed amendment to the 2005 International Health Regulations, which bind all 194 UN member states, in contrast to our constitutional amendments that require a two-thirds vote from our Senate. Only a simple majority of the World Health Organization mandates that we do what they say regarding a pandemic. That means 98 votes out of 194. As part of this plan, the World Health Organization has contracted the German-based Deutsche Telekom subsidiary T-Systems to develop a global vaccine passport system with plans to link every person on the planet with a QR code digital ID. Remember the video, cryptocurrency video, she said, we can even give IDs and have people buy and sell who don't have bank accounts, right? The unbanked. And they're going to start there. They're going to try to give everyone a global digital ID. Vaccination certificates that are tamper-proof and digitally verifiable build trust. World Health Organization therefore supporting member states in building national and regional trust networks and verification technology. This is on the move, on a global reach, global transactions, fast transactions, inexpensive transactions, well-recorded transactions globally against nations. In the global order, you have to have that kind of vehicle. There's some future benefits of the new electronic methods. I read about this in my Final Prophecies book. These newer electronic methods of buying and selling are being formatted in a way that could facilitate not only a cashless society, but also offer global citizens a better access to education, travel, healthcare, vaccine, voting, banking, housing, and a host of other business and or family-related benefits. In other words, everything can be contained in the blockchain technology. You won't need a driver's license. You won't need a passport. But is there a supernatural component to the mark of the beast? A lot of people say, well, gee, I'm very concerned about this. I don't want to do the MasterCard thing where I use my Face ID or my palm of my hand. You need to know that receiving the mark of the beast is a choice at that time. It's a pledge of allegiance that I'm going to worship you. You become part of the Antichrist's club, if you will. Right? You don't get it unless you're going to. It's a reward for those who are willing to worship him. He's not going to pull the wool over your eyes and say, ha ha, I caught you, right? You're making a choice to do that. So the cashless society is part of it. You can't buy or sell without. That seems to be a technology, but it can include so much more. Digital IDs, tracking, all your records, blockchain technology. These technologies exist right now, and they're almost foolproof. So the Antichrist will be able to, he won't be omnipresent. God's omnipresent. He searches our hearts and minds, sees what our thoughts. The Antichrist can't do that, but he can track everybody's footsteps. He can know what they're doing. And if they don't comply, he can shut them off with a button. So when the time comes and he implements that technology, he will simply flip a switch and all the cryptocurrencies from the world will go into his coffer. But they have to be in place. He can't implement them at the mid part of the tribulation. And all of a sudden he says, we're going to have a cashless society, false prophet. How are we going to do that? Well, it's already going to be up and running. They just need to put it all into their blockchain scenario. So I think when he's resurrected and they're marveling, I think there's a thought here. I read about this. Maybe Satan's prodigy, the Antichrist, will turn the big garden lie full circle. Perhaps the seed of the serpent will do more than echo Satan's sentiment that you will be like God, and up the ante and promise to show his worshippers how they can actually become like God, how they can become immortal. Everyone's been looking for the fountain of youth, right? A shot at immortality now that might be enough to sway someone off the fence to worship the Antichrist and take his mark, especially if someone incorporated within the mark contained a supernatural component. What if the Antichrist said something like this? In order to achieve a divine nature like me, you must become more like me, which means you must undergo human enhancement that upgrades your DNA to resemble mine. Because those things are going on too. A couple headlines. Superpowers aren't just for superheroes anymore. Want some? San Diego Union Tribune. Brain chips could give people superintelligence. Superhuman abilities could lurk under your skin. Insertable technology could launch a new type of human. If you alter your DNA, you take yourself out of the image of God. and you become unredeemable, because the people who take the mark of the beast are no longer redeemable. They suffer the wrath of God. I'll get into that in just a minute. There's no more grace and mercy for them. They've made a conscious choice, likely to alter their image. The future of humanity, superpowers are within our reach. We stand at an unprecedented juncture in our history. It's not a question of if we develop superpowers, it's a question of when we develop them. U.S. Defense Intelligence warns of the artificial intelligence human hybrid soldiers from China. China's already developing an army of super soldiers. So with the midpoint of the tribulation, people are going to be wondering if they should take the mark. They're going to be hearing it's a bad idea. So that we're going to look at the pros and the cons as I wind down. One, you won't get beheaded, because if you don't take the mark of the beast and you're a believer, you're going to be beheaded. You'll be running for your life. You become a part of a worshiper of the Antichrist. I mean, some people feel like they want to be part of that club. Like, so for instance, I'll use a Catholic, for instance. I was born a Catholic, I'll always be a Catholic. They take pride in that. I'm not trying to bash the Catholics, although I do think the Vatican's a harlot world religion. But you can buy as a consumer or sell as a merchant. You can obtain a personal world citizen digital ID that connects you to all the global services such as universal health care, universal basic income, global banking, world travel, public education, and more. And maybe just superhuman capabilities for immortality and eternal life. I mean, those are kind of things you would say. They might be thinking, hey, why wouldn't I take this thing? Well, here's some of the cons. The benefit's only going to last for 3.5 years. And the minute they get the mark of the beast, they receive loathsome sores all over their body. They get to drink of God's wrath. They get to lose their shot at salvation. They get to watch the Antichrist and the false prophet get cast into the lake of fire. They get to be judged at the white throne judgment, and they get to themselves be cast into the lake of fire at the end of the millennium. So it's a bad idea, but it's going to be appealing to a lot of people. The majority of the population will do it. All right? So listen, I've had a really good time freaking you all out over the last 2 days. So John, you want to take us out in a prayer?
Oh no, you don't get off that easily.
We got a Q&A, right?
Yeah. So you've been freaking everybody else out. So now we get to ask you questions, maybe to stump you. I think I was thinking about this as you're going through all this, thinking this is a very interesting group, because you've got some people in here who are real old, like you and me.
Well, that's where you look when you say that.
I'm not talking about you. No, Bill and me.
Yeah.
You're a year older than me, right? So you got.
Did you have to bring that up? No. How about a little respect?
You told me yesterday to respect my elders, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you got those of us who are older, especially if you've been a believer for some years, you've had a chance to watch some of these things develop. But at the same time, very often those who are of an older persuasion tend not to be as aware of the technology, whereas then we blend in with the young adults who are living in that technology. They're swimming in that technology. And I think it's interesting to have the two sets of minds in the same room. The thing that really strikes me, when we talk about blockchain technology, the digital currency, it's very tempting for us as Christians to look at all that and say, well, I'm not going to be here for that, because that's the mark of the beast and all of that, so I don't have to worry about that. Well, you don't have to worry, but you better be aware that this is coming down, and it's probably coming down before. I mean, the mark of the beast is not coming while we're still here, but the technology already exists, and it's ready to come into play. And there are so many benefits that are sold, or the digital technology, digital currency technology is sold as so beneficial to everybody. But the fact that we're having, I guess Josh and I were talking about it today, it's a programmable currency. So once it's been determined that you as an individual, or we, let's say, as a group, Christians, are a threat to our society, then certain privileges, what we consider to be our rights, but then are considered privileges of being a good citizen of the United States, can suddenly be removed. We can still have access to the currency, but to use that digital currency for various things. And I'm not even talking about buying a weapon or buying ammunition, but certainly those types of things, because we know that Christians are the greatest threat to our society. At least that's how we're seen. But so many other things that we take for granted would be easily stripped away from us. That's the part of a programmable technology. Anybody who knows anything about metadata and that sort of thing, that's all involved in every transaction you make. So whether it's a transaction of receiving a paycheck, or the transactions involved in whether you're just going to the Giant store to buy some food or anywhere else, all of that is tracked, and therefore not just tracked, but can be kept from you. And so there's a brave new world aspect of things here that most of us are not prepared for at all, but it's definitely coming.
They say mass adoption. This is right just before COVID. Could be of cryptocurrencies by 2030, but with COVID, it's accelerated. And you can see right now all these nations, over 87 nations, are moving rapidly to get the better Bitcoin. Yeah. They want it for their country.
Bill mentioned something, before we get into the Q&A, Bill mentioned something earlier this evening about an EMP. And I don't know how many of you actually think about electromagnetic pulse and the effect it would have on our world. But I remember I used to be very interested in it because, like Bill, we were both, there was part of our Christian life where God used a man by the name of Chuck Missler in our lives. And Chuck was one of the guys who used to talk about the EMP all the time. Yeah. And I remember Renee and I were traveling somewhere, and we were in the airport, and I went to a bookstore in the airport and buy one of those overpriced paperbacks, and something to entertain my mind while I was flying. And I bought a book, which is not a Christian book, but at the same time, I got to tell you, it's worth reading. It was called 1 Second After.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
1 Second After. It's probably about 400 pages long, which for a lot of people, especially in this day and age, no one reads anymore. Many people say, 400 pages, I can't read that much. I think I read half of the book in the flight down to Florida. You can just move through it quickly. But it was all about what happened when an EMP went off in America from the perspective of a small family in a town in North Carolina, and how he and his children experienced what happened in that little town before they realized that this was not just regional, but it was a national problem. All communications went down, unless you had a car that was built, I don't know when the magic date was, but before whatever, 1985 or something, with no circuitry in it. Everything shuts down. You can't start your car, you can't do anything. And it was a wonderful illustration. It's all fiction, but this was the guy who wrote the white paper on the electromagnetic pulse threat to America, presented it to the Senate just before 9/11 occurred. And of course, then it was lost because of 9/11. So this guy knows what he's talking about. Highly recommend it. 1 Second After. It's a book that you won't be able to put down, but it's a great illustration of the effect it would have on your lives. Why am I saying that stuff? I'm not here to preach fear, but I think that we live often as Christians, and many of you have heard me say this, but we live in this bubble. We think that it's all great, and we're going to get raptured, hallelujah, and so all the big nasty stuff's going to happen later. True, the biggest nasty stuff's going to happen later, but there's a lot of nasty stuff that's probably going to happen before that.
That could,
and we should be prepared. I'm not predicting it happens, but we should be prepared. To your point last night about how do you prepare in terms of food and things like that. So
one comment like that too, along the lines of what he's saying before we get in the Q&A, is that Newt Gingrich, probably about a decade ago, was saying the number one threat in the Department of Homeland Security was an EMP.
Right. And
that threat really hasn't gone away, but you don't hear that as the number one threat anymore. Right now, one of the top threats is, right-wing fundamentalists, right?
Yeah, right. And it was Gingrich who wrote the foreword to this book for that reason. if that's an endorsement to you. So, all right, so you've heard a lot of things tonight. The basic rules are, let's try to keep our questions to the topic of this evening. But having said that, I'm going to violate it by asking you a question that's been asked to me twice, once last night and once this evening. So, Bill, all of this stuff is very interesting and it's compelling. But you keep telling me about Israel and Turkey and Russia and Iran and all this stuff happening in this one area of the world. But what do you do with China? I mean, aren't they even involved in any of this? What do you think?
Well, we try to find out the future of a country biblically by seeing where they fit in the Bible. China seems to be the kings of the East in Revelation chapter 16. Mm-hmm. So they seem to exist on into the end of the tribulation. They are coming across the dried up Euphrates, it looks like, to meet with the Antichrist at the Valley of Armageddon for the final campaign to fight off God. So they do exist. They're definitely an alarm. I just was at the prophecy conference in Colorado Springs with Prophecy Watchers, and Robert McGinnis, Fox News correspondent, retired lieutenant colonel. He did a whole talk on China, and China is a huge threat. They're doing a lot of things to subvert America, and we need to be really careful about watching them at this point in time. And the Biden administration has backed off. Trump was kind of confronting them, China.
Yeah.
But they do show up, they do exist on through the end of the tribulation. It appears to be the kings of the East would be typically thought to be coming out of the Asia Orient area. Revelation 16, which is I think it's the sixth trumpet judgment, bowl judgment. I think it is sixth bowl judgment. Yeah.
Right. All right. So, who has a question? Phil.
All right. With this here money now, if you get a paycheck and you're not getting a paycheck anymore, and this currency stuff that goes on, that will go like right in your bank account or something. And they'll have track of it, but you won't be able to touch it unless if you have something that's electronic, like a chip in you or something, or on your forehead. Like, is that what you were saying?
Well, so how many of you get Social Security?
Let's define first. Are we talking about before the mark of the beast or after the mark of the beast? We're just talking digital currency in general.
Yeah, but
okay.
Because we're not going to be here for the mark of the beast.
I don't think.
But like now, they're going to. Because I've heard of people having a chip in their hand or something. They were talked into it in the hospital.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm just. That's why I'm just. Is it the same thing or is it different?
Well, I asked the question: who gets Social? I get Social Security. It's automatically deposited in my bank every fourth Wednesday of the month, right? I think that's the thing. There'll be universal base. There'll be income that's put into your blockchain, your digital wallet, that sort of thing. Whether you have a typical bank account or not, that's why a lot of the banks are trying to get on board and have digital currencies offered to them too.
Okay. So would you have a certain kind of like right now, I have a MasterCard or a bank card. But you have to have a certain bank card because that would keep track of it with the chip.
Well, we'll see. I mean.
Yeah, we don't have all the rules. We're just talking about the general technology. So one could presume, though, Phil, one could presume that in order for there to be a government-mandated digital currency, in other words, replacing all the paper in your wallet, for those of us who actually carry paper, I'm not talking about those of a younger persuasion here, but which always amazes me. You can go into 7-Eleven and buy a cup of coffee and swipe a card. But yeah,
Apple Pay.
How old heck am I just by saying that? But we're talking about if it's government-mandated digital currency, then in order for that to be in place, then there would also have to be some form of a medium that you would use to gain access to it, right? So that would be a technology that would be forced in place.
You'd have a digital ID, whether it's on your body or Face ID.
Well, that wouldn't necessarily have to be a digital ID prior to the mark of the beast. It could be, as long as you have some form, it could be a card. It doesn't necessarily have to be biometric,
right. But you'll have
that would make sense.
It'll come with a digital ID, whether it's on your card or whatever, that sort of thing. I would think. Yeah. And also, we're talking about replacing fiat currencies, which has been around ever since mankind pretty much, coins and stuff. So it's not going to be an easy conversion to convince a lot of people. Be easier to convince a younger generation because they're pretty much technical, right?
Well, and actually, if you look at the video that Bill showed, which was actually that woman was AI. I mean, she was not a real person, which to me was amazing in the first place. But it was sold, and it will be sold as providing maximum freedom. When in reality, fiat currency offers the greatest freedom because you can do whatever you want with it. This sounds like it's great freedom, except that you're restricted as to where you can use it or when. So, yeah. Okay, other questions? I can't hear you. Stand up. How do you calculate 666? It's 2 times 333.
Yeah.
Or it's 3 times 666. So, how do you calculate?
Well, that's really hard. There's some gematria, Hebrew things that they come up with. The Hebrew language has a number with every alphabetic letter. I personally think it's quite simple. You know, when you get your MasterCard, it's got like 4388, a preface. Every MasterCard has that, and then you get all the different ones. I think it's going to be 666, and then whatever your digital ID is after that. That's my personal opinion. So you're in his system with the preface of 666. I could be wrong.
But is
that's
what
a hard one.
Is that what you meant? In other words, what it says in Revelation is it's the number of his name. Right. It's not necessarily the mark on the card. It's the number of his name.
Probably combines his name alphanumerically, and that's what he probably has the prefix on the digital ID. That's just a hard one to understand. I've looked at the gematria stuff. I don't really think it's that solid, some of the teaching on that.
Right. Yeah.
That's a hard one to understand.
Other questions? John, we'll come to you.
Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies. We get into a lot of discussion with this because some of my friends are mining it, they're buying it, they have it. And I keep asking them one question. When you die, how do you transfer that to your wife? And apparently you cannot. There is no way to do that. When you die, it dies. Have you heard anything like that?
I'd not heard that, no. Bitcoin's going to, and those types of currencies, Ethereum, they're going to start coming under regulations.
Yeah.
Right now they're unregulated. Pretty soon they'll start coming into regulations.
Tim.
Yes. So I guess a question is, I know young adults' perspective versus maybe somebody a little bit older might be slightly different, right? I know we talked a little bit the other day, and I told you, as a young adult, sometimes it's like we want the Lord to come back, but we also want to enjoy, life
Right.
and things like that. How do you look at this from a Christian perspective? Like, it's easy to get almost frustrated and be like, I want to take up arms against the oppressors, right, or fight against the evil in the world. As Christians, though, that's not necessarily what we're called to do. Like, how do you speak to that to younger Christians and older Christians? Like, are we called to be martyrs for the cause, or are we called to fight up against the oppressive governments and the evils of this world?
Yeah, and we talk about these, we see all these signs converging. It looks like we're in the end times. It looks like we're pretty deep in the end times. But how long will the end times prolong themselves? God is long suffering. You have to live the best life you can, but you got to be aware of what's going on. Most of your peers out there have no clue about what's coming and what we're talking about here. And they're going to fall for this stuff. The millennials will stand in line for this mark of the beast because they're used to this whole system. And there'll be signs and lying wonders. They'll be, whoa, once the rapture happens, the supernatural will be the natural, the paranormal will be the new normal. The world changes immediately, dramatically, in the twinkling of an eye. So, it could be cryptocurrencies, converting fiat currency into cryptocurrencies, digital IDs. Could happen over the next 5-10 years. Getting rid of all the cash could be another 5-10 years. We don't really know the time. You have to occupy, you have to redeem the time, but you really need to be smart and realize that the technologies that exist today have a lot of end-time implications.
Yeah.
You could have a cashless society now. When, for instance, there's a technology where it talks about the Antichrist is going to kill 2 witnesses in the street of Jerusalem, and they'll lie dead in the streets for 3.5 days, and they will have tormented the world. It says the world's giving gifts. They see these 2 dead guys on the street, and people would say 100 years ago, Bible can't be correct. There's no way the whole world, the eyewitness account could see 2 dead people. They couldn't see that in the UK. They couldn't see 2 people. Well, you don't need to be an eyewitness account now, and you can be with your cell phone. The technologies are here that they were trying to convey to us, 2,000 years ago.
2 things. First of all, do you think, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but do you think that's answering the question you were asking?
I kind of had a 2-part there. So
Right.
To answer the first part. The second part, how should Christians be living knowing these things to come?
So I guess I'm interested in your perspective, but I would just add this. One of the things that I became aware of over the years, I was one of these guys who back in the early 90s got very excited about this whole idea of the third temple coming and all of the plans for its construction, because that tells you that we're that close to the end, right? But it's easy to get so excited about that we lose sight of what that really means. We lose sight that temple's going to be defiled. And that also is the time when 2/3 of Israel is going to be destroyed. I mean, the Holocaust was terrible. That was 1/3 of Israel in the world. This is going to be 2/3 of Israel in the world, Zechariah 13. And so when you start to look at that, or even things like seeing, I think it's really important for us as Christians to study the things that Bill's talking about, the Psalm 83 war, understanding that there's this ring of nations who all have who share borders with Israel, who are about to declare war as a confederation. Never in the history of Israel, going back thousands of years, never has that happened. So that's about to happen. And following that, there's another, the outer ring that Bill refers to, the outer ring, the Magog invasion, who then are going to invade. Well, we can see those pieces on the board. It's like looking at a chessboard and say, okay, that play is going to happen. And we can get excited about that because that tells us how close we are. But we can also be losing sight of the many thousands, really millions of lives. When talking about Ezekiel 38, millions of lives that are going to be lost. Even if they're not Jewish, I mean, it's still life, right? And God calls us to preserve life. So it's easy to lose sight of those things. So how should we respond, regardless of our age? We should keep those things in focus and understand they are going to happen because God has already ordained it, right? And yet at the same time, there's something terrifying about all this. So we have to hold that, and it's hard, but we have to hold that in balance somehow in our lives and in our walk. But it should also compel us to righteous living, and it should compel us in terms of how we share these truths with our friends. There's more to that. I don't want to dominate this, but what are your thoughts?
I think that's right. You need most of the world, most of your peers, they get the secular worldview with the fake news and the censored social networks and that sort of thing, and you're getting the biblical narrative and the prophetic perspective, and you're equipped to know how to kind of navigate through these times that these people are not. It's a great time to be alive if you know what we know. It's a fearful time to be alive if you don't. So. Basically, I would say, we don't know when this is all going to come down the pipe, but you just need to, like you said, redeem the time. If you think Jesus could come at any moment, which he really could now, because that's what it's all pointing towards, is Jesus is going to come get us out before all this stuff really hits the fan, then you would be living a righteous, holy life, and you'd be redeeming the time.
Yeah. We got a question right over here.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, you said that the sign or the mark would be obvious. It would be like a choice, and they would choose the satanic option.
But they won't.
Okay. The question has to do with the mark of the beast, and that Bill has said that the mark will be something that a person chooses to receive. Right? Now, the question is...
So, I guess with anything, with money, the internet, there's always this choice. We can use it for good, we can use it for evil. So how is cryptocurrency any different? How is it obviously satanic? Obviously you can use it for good, but you could also use it for evil. So what's
Right.
But let's be careful. So the question was, the cryptocurrency that can also be either good or evil. So how do we call it satanic? And I don't think you are calling it satanic per se,
Right.
because it can have a value. It has no value. It's amoral, right? So it's how a person uses it or how a government uses it tyrannically on its citizens.
Right.
But let's also be careful not to confuse, not that you are, but I can get that way. Let's not confuse the introduction of digital currency in our nation or in the world with the beast system, because the beast system is imposed after the tribulation period begins. So we're talking about something that is already happening now in our society. It's that after that marker, when the tribulation period begins, it's after that the great world leader will at some point institute. He'll take that technology and then say, but you can't participate in this economy unless you receive the mark of the beast.
So it'll kind of set its stage almost, and then afterwards it will kind of...
It'll be manipulated. The people will be manipulated.
Yeah, they're going to initially sell all these nations will sell the advantages of cryptocurrency. And there's a lot of neat things. You got everything you want in a digital ID, whether it's a card or whether you ultimately take a mark or whatever. So it's going to be sold the advantages of it. What he's talking about is clear. When you get to the end, it's a conscious choice that I want to worship this guy and I want to be part of his system, and then they're going to make that choice. So people won't be duped. They'll be consciously making that choice. But that's not till the midpoint of the tribulation. But we see the technology coming together rapidly at this point that it seems to be that he will embrace that and he'll put it into his coffer.
Makes
But
sense.
that could still be down the road, you know.
Makes sense, yeah. But I feel like the internet just by itself could be an option there.
An option for...
For him to utilize that, to manipulate it, however.
Sure. There's a lot of technology will be at us.
Alexa, Google.
Yeah.
You say something on Alexa, and next thing you know, you got on your social. I was talking about getting some cowboy boots. Next thing you know, you're on your Facebook page, and all of a sudden, cowboy boot ads are showing up all over the place. You know,
I was
they're
wondering
really
where those
smart.
ads were coming from. Okay, we have a question back here. We can't hear you.
What do you think a biblical generation is?
Well, there's 40 years, 70 years, or 100 years. I think you usually come up with, right?
Yeah.
There's three. So it's,
Those are the three major ones.
What's the contents of what?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of like Matthew 25, when you say the generation
Mm-hmm.
sees these things.
I knew that was where that was going. You gonna read that?
Yeah, okay. So
So we have an answer for that.
go ahead, finish your question, Jill.
I look at that and I'm just, we don't know the day or the hour, but we are supposed to be looking at these signs and that, I'm just curious what
Yeah.
your opinion is on what is a biblical generation.
Okay, well, how about if I answer the first part and you take the rest? So for anybody who didn't hear, the question Jill has is, what is a biblical generation? And the reason for asking that question is that Jesus makes a comment in Matthew 24. He says, and I'll start a little earlier than what you're referring to. He says, learn this parable from the fig tree. And the fig tree is a notorious picture of Israel throughout the scripture, right? When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also know that when you see these things, that it's near, even at the door. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. So the key verse is verse 34. Surely I say to you, this generation. What generation? You're referring to the generation that sees the fig tree budding. Okay, and we all interpret that as May 14 of 1948, where Israel becomes a nation, officially recognized on the international scene. So then for years, for those who don't track with some of this, I just want to give some background. So people have said, well, if Israel became a nation, and they did, May 14, 1948, Jesus says this generation won't pass away until these things have been fulfilled. What generation? The generation that sees Israel become a nation. Therefore, the question, it's a very pregnant question, how long is a generation? Because if we can figure out how long a generation is and when that generation should pass away, we can be able to set dates, right? So you could say that it's 40 years, 70 years, or 100 years. Those are the three common candidates for a generation. And it's a great discussion. It's wonderful to take you on all night long with your friends to discuss it. I personally don't think that's what Jesus meant. I personally believe, and everybody can challenge it as far as I'm concerned, but what he's saying, I believe, when he says, I tell you this generation, the word in Greek, I believe, is genia. He's referring to like that ethnic group. What ethnic group? Israel. Israel will not pass away. Jews will not pass away from this earth until all these things have been fulfilled. Israel will not be removed from the world until all the things that he's talking about have been fulfilled. So it's actually one of those things that we spend all of our time trying to figure out how long is a generation when that's not what he's talking about. He's saying the people of Israel, right, will not pass away from the earth. What are your thoughts?
I agree with that. Because, so let's slap 70 years on 1948. That's 2018. So you'd have to back out 7 years of tribulation, take it down to 2000 and whatever that is, 11. So the rapture had to happen in 2010 or 2011. It didn't happen. So then they go, well, let's move the sliding scale to a 100-year generation, right? So we go to 48 coming up, so that means the tribulation has to happen in 41, right? 2041. So he's right. What he said is the generation that sees all these things. Well, what things would they see that's in the history books that's past? Nation will come against nation. There'll be earthquakes, beginning of sorrows. There'll be a temple, abomination of desolation he's talking about, Jews fleeing, all those things. So he's saying that last generation of Jews will not pass. It's a word of comfort to them until all these things take place. So all these things he's talking about have to take place, and they haven't all taken place yet.
And by the time you figured all that out, it's going to take place. So, Dave has a question, and then we'll come over to you.
So you mentioned like Fountain of Youth and the superhumans. So is the great deception of the Antichrist potentially a promise for eternal life, and is that tied into the mark of the beast somehow with a genetic modification of your DNA?
My educated guess is yes. I think he's going to offer them more than just the ability to buy and sell. That digital ID is going to have all these neat things. You can, all your ID, all your medical, every kind of record you got can be encapsulated in this. But it's more than that. I'm choosing to worship you. I'm willing to alter my DNA or whatever the case is because I want to be like you. You tell me I can be immortal. I think that's what's going to sell these guys. And I think that's where they become unredeemable once they alter their image.
Yeah, I agree. Yes?
Is there a correlation between the 66 books of the Bible and the Mark of the Beast 666?
The question is whether there's a correlation between the 66 books of the Bible and the 66 books of the Bible and the Mark of the Beast 666.
Well, if there were 666 books in the Bible, I'd say maybe. I've never put that correlation together personally.
Yeah.
I don't think there is one.
I would see it as coincidental.
There are no coincidences.
Well, I know that, but it's...
We just haven't figured it out.
Okay, that's interesting, but sometimes we come across things that are interesting numerical anomalies because there's only so many numbers unless you're talking about infinity. And so at some point, I mean, even like, how many people share the same birthday? Are those things coincidences? We could say coincidence is not a kosher word. That's true, but I think that's more applicable to use when we're talking about strictly biblical things. I think it's interesting.
If you look at the Jewish version of the Bible, there are over 600 books of the Bible.
There's 600 books in the Jewish Bible? Is that what you said? I didn't hear that.
That's what she said.
Oh, 613 mitzvot. Yeah, there are 613. You have 606. You have 66. Let's just get this one straight. There are 66 books in the full canon of Scripture. There are 39 of those in the Old and 27 in the New. If we talked about the Old Testament for our purposes, in the English Bible there are 39 books, but in the Hebrew Bible there are, I'm pretty sure it's just 3 that are condensed. So it's 63 books. So at some point we have to say, okay, is that coincidental? If you were going to draw to me a more fun coincidence, it would be between the 66 books of the Bible and the 66 chapters of Isaiah. Because that starts to line up very interesting, because you go through the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, and it's harsh, difficult stuff. And then you get in this wonderful expression of grace from chapter 40 on. So that's kind of how I would say it. There's a question. Okay, yes.
Do you think the Vatican has any role in this? I mean, they've been dancing with the devil for a long time. They love the color purple. I'm not going to go any further, but their wealth, the Pope wants one world religion, one world currency.
Well, I personally, and I've written extensively about it in the last Prophecies book, and there's a DVD out there called Mystery Babylon, Is it Mecca or Rome? I give you all the reasons why I think the Vatican, Roman Catholicism is the harlot world religion. They're not looking for a rapture. They're going to be left behind, in my estimation. I point out that I believe they're written about in Revelation chapter 2, the church letter to the church of Thyatira, which has a prophetic implication. And he says, because you have this doctrine of Jezebel, which was the worst Old Testament prophetess, false prophetess. I gave you time to repent, but you didn't repent. And I will therefore cast your children into the sickbed of the great tribulation, and I will kill your children with death. And what happens is they're going to go into if they're the harlot, the midpoint of the tribulation, they're going to be desolated by the 10 kings, and they'll be stranded. They'll be cast into the sickbed of the great tribulation without their religion anymore. And Catholics will have to make one of 3 choices. They'll either have to worship the Antichrist, which they're not going to like because he just desolated their religion. They're going to have to become believers and risk their life along with the other believers who don't accept the mark of the beast. Or there's Catholic eschatology, where they believe they're supposed to flee in this period of time to the wilderness. They think they're the woman in the wilderness in Revelation chapter 12. They actually have Catholic eschatology that says they're going to get persecuted. They need to flee as Catholics to a place.
Yeah.
So I've written extensively about it. Pope quotes, catechisms, all kinds of things. They say they're the one true church. Marian apparitions. Mary has said through her visionaries, I will appear again to all denominations like I appeared in Zaytun. And she appeared in Zaytun, Egypt, 1968 to 1970, over a Coptic church. It's not Mary. It's a demonic feminine. And it's a satanic thing trying to influence people. So after the rapture, mankind has a double religious jeopardy. The first thing that happens is not the Antichrist. It's the harlot world religion. Second one is the Antichrist, where he forces people to take the mark and worship him. I give you all the info. Did you have the book?
Yeah, remember I was standing there talking to you when I bought it?
Yeah.
Just say yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
One of the things, though, that while the Roman Catholic Church is not looking for the rapture, they are looking for, they have their own observatory, and they are looking for extraterrestrials, have even said that Pope Francis himself has said that he would baptize any extraterrestrial visitors. So there is some interesting theology that has to support that. So there was someone here, I see hands different. Okay, Gail.
Just more of a comment, back to 666 and things like that, and they show a lot of symbolism. I saw something the other day, World Economic Forum, and then they have a circle through the emblem.
Yeah.
So the circle goes through all the O's and forms 666.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, you find a lot of interesting
probably
symbolism.
Not intentional, but that's interesting.
For those of you who are familiar with Monster energy drink, No, serious. If you're familiar with the logo, which is kind of a thing that looks like that, well, that's a Vav in Hebrew. That's the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And as you know, all the Hebrew alphabet has numerical values. The first 10 are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, 6. So 1, 2, 3, 6, 6, 6. It's interesting. So there was another, Michelle. I'm sorry?
That's what I was going to ask when you brought up the thing about the aliens.
Uh-huh.
Like this increased push that they've been doing, like on the History Channel, and all about this
Okay.
panspermia, and talking about that's where our true origins lie.
Yeah.
That they're pushing this whole thing.
Yeah.
That man's origins are basically that we come.
True enough. And if you want to have an idea where we're headed, watch media. I'm dead serious.
Well, that's going to be the delusion that they're going to sell after the rapture.
Part of it.
And you would
Yeah.
mention that before.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what Sister Salus thought about that.
I think
you're on, brother.
I think the lie, the strong delusion, could ultimately manifest in that manner, where because we know that angels are going to be cast out of heaven in the war in heaven in the mid part of the tribulation. They're going to come down. They're not going to look like fallen angels, and they're going to appear like higher intelligent beings from another place. They're going to say you're not alone in this universe, which will shoot the biblical narrative out the window. And they're going to dupe mankind. They're higher than us as far as their strength and their intelligence. And so I think it could come into play. And I think you can see more and more UF disclosure. You're getting soft disclosure now. You can get full disclosure pretty soon.
Mike.
Hey, so my question is...
Louder, brother.
Okay, sorry. So my question is, like, growing up now in this time, like, the world's changing so quick. So back in the 80s, when, you know, like, there's the credit card, there's Cold War, the tension for the rapture and all this stuff as high as it is now. Like, was that world, were the pieces in play back then as well?
Walk halfway up the aisle and say that. We're not able to interpret what you're saying from up here. Okay, so something about the 80s. What, are you afraid of us? You can only go that far? Come on, you can stand right here, Mike. Oh, no. He's afraid of you.
So I was saying, like, growing up in this time, like, this is all that, like, us young adults have known. Like, the world is just rapidly changing. But back in the 80s, when you have the credit card being introduced, the Cold War happened, where the tension for the rapture is high back then as well.
What about the rapture?
Tensions.
Tensions about the rapture? Okay, the interest in the rapture, you mean? Okay, interest in the rapture. When I came to Christ in 1974, the interest in the rapture was sky high. In fact, if you go back, I mean, I didn't live that long ago, maybe Bill did, but when Israel became a nation in 1948, I remember my father used to tell me about this, because my father had a sister who was a holy roller, right? And he remembered that when Israel came into the land, they all thought they were getting raptured that day, based upon what we just saw in Matthew 24. So there's always been times when the interest in the rapture was high. 1948 and back in the 67 war. You know, when the Six-Day War happened and Israel took the old city, people believe, okay, the time of the Gentiles, or time of the Gentiles has been removed, and now
fullness of
the fullness has happened, and we're going to get raptured. Right? Didn't happen. 74, everybody was seeing that. Late Great Planet Earth was the book that had come out. Hal Lindsey had written that. So everybody was excited about that. Move into the 80s. There was another wave of that in the early 80s and really lasted throughout the decade, into the early 90s. And then since the mid-90s, I'd say it's waned. And what's happened is those of us who were maybe not your age back in the 90s, but much younger, many people who were the boomers, right, said, let's just get on with life. I mean, we're not getting raptured. No one said that out loud, but in effect, that's what has happened. And we've seen this cooling in the church. And Christians are like, let's just live life. Who knows when he's coming back? Which is true, we don't know, but we're to be prepared. So, but now we see these things coming to pass. And Jesus said, when you see these things come to pass, look up, for your redemption is drawing near. Right? So.
It's the interest in the rapture is increasing dramatically right now.
Absolutely.
It waned, like he said. I'd have people come up to me going, yeah, that rapture stuff, everybody's excited with Hal Lindsey, and it never happened. And I said, well, yeah, but we're 40 years closer now. And now you're seeing all this stuff going on right now. So, Chuck Missler used to use this expression that when you see the Christmas decorations going up in the mall, Thanksgiving's just around the corner. In other words, when you see all the end time signs converging, as if the Christmas example, the rapture will precede that. So we're seeing the Christmas decorations, if you want to call it that, being set up in the world.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are these vaccines making our DNA?
Are these vaccines changing our DNA?
That they're making us take the vaccines. Are they changing our DNA?
Yeah.
That's the question. Are they changing our DNA?
Well, I'm not an expert on that.
Dr. Bill?
Moderna stands for modified RNA. So probably, but I mean, I don't think you're becoming unredeemable because you took a vaccine. It's
Right.
certainly not the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
I'm personally not taking the vaccine. But
Other questions? Yes, so the question over here.
I'm not sure if you like touched upon this, but regarding Psalm 83,
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering what your opinion was, or if you stated it, regarding the judgment of God and how Israel is going to take down the walls, right, to then move into the next phase.
Are you saying what's the relationship between the Psalm 83 war and the walls in Israel coming down?
What do you see being that judgment that is then going to have Israel remove the walls to become
well, when they don't have any more need for the walls, right now they have a need for the walls to the north because they're trying to stop Hezbollah infiltrating. They're trying to stop Palestinian terror from getting.
the judgment from the surrounding, right?
Right, after Israel wins the war of Psalm 83 and they no longer have the concerns about the enemies that want to wipe them off the map, they will no longer need those walls. They're not aesthetic. They're not there because they're a tourist attraction. Right, so they're gonna tear them down. The Berlin Wall came down really quick.
Right, but your point is, you're asking why would those walls come down? Okay, and what's the relationship if we have the Psalm 83 war and then the Magog war? Something happens between inner ring, outer ring, so that Ezekiel 38 it comes to fulfillment that they would be living securely, right, without walls. And I think to your point, I'd say the same thing, that Israel's perception of the threat is, to Israel is not simply Hezbollah or Hamas. The threat to Israel is also within their own borders. Some of the walls that Bill showed are around Bethlehem, around the West Bank regions, some of these different cities that are unsafe places. In order to drive a certain, what we would call an interstate, main highway in Israel from south to north, you're glad that wall is up because of some of the things that were happening before that wall went up. So, but when the Psalm 83 war happens, the threat within the country itself would be neutralized because many of those people would be involved in that threat. So that would be the reason.
Palestinians, yeah.
Yeah. Take two more. Someone who hasn't asked a question. No one's got a question? Yeah, but you already asked a question. Yes, sir.
Do you think the two-state solution will ever become reality?
I don't think it will. If it does, it'll be very short-lived.
Yeah.
The solution that is biblical is not political. It would have been nice if it would have been, but it's when diplomacy fails, wars begin. That's always been the case in history, and diplomacy has failed. They've tried the same failed attempts to have a two-state solution. Biden's trying it again. And he needs to be careful because we're pressuring Israel to divide their land. God's trying to bring Jews in the land, expand them into the land. That's their land. We're trying to constrict that process.
So anybody who would choose not to ask a question tonight, but instead would prefer to send me a text, like 3 people did last night, now's your time to ask the question. Questions? Surely someone has a question. Young adults must have questions. Over here.
I just want to know, do you think that we are so far along that the Antichrist is already alive?
Do we think the Antichrist is alive? Satan has been known for 2,000 years. The time was going to come where he would no longer be restrained from putting forward his whole show, supernatural signs and lying wonders. Mm-hmm. He didn't know when the restraint would be removed, but it parallels with when the church is taken out. And he didn't know, and nobody knows when the church is going to be raptured except God. So he's always had to have a candidate, in my estimation, available to be the Antichrist. And as soon as he's no longer restrained, he's going to go offer the kingdoms of the world to that guy, like he offered Jesus Christ the kingdoms of the world, and Jesus rejected it. This guy's going to accept it. And he's going to be accompanied by signs and lying wonders. It's like, why wouldn't he take it, right?
Yeah. So he's always had to have a candidate ready at any point. You haven't asked a question, Megs. When we get raptured, she's asking. You're whispering.
It's my understanding that only God knows. Jesus doesn't even know when we're going to get raptured. And when we get raptured, will Satan know? Will he try to hurt us on the way up? Yeah.
Well, it's the twinkling of an eye. It happens really quick, like a thief.
Let me make sure that everybody understands the question. The question was that as for the day and the hour, Jesus said, back in Mark 13, that as of that day, no one knows, not the angels in heaven, no man knows, not the angels in heaven, not even the Son of Man. Now, that's what he said then. That doesn't mean he doesn't know now. But anyhow, so first of all, in terms of that, since none of us know, and presumably then the devil doesn't, yes, I would agree with that, then the question is, would Satan make an effort to hurt us on the way up? Okay? It's not a silly question. Okay? It's not, I'm sorry?
I said to be glad to get rid of us.
Well, so it's not a silly question, but do you think there's any evidence from the scripture that we could find to support that?
I don't find any evidence to support that. Yeah. He's trying to hurt us before. Yeah. But it happens in the twinkling of an eye. He wouldn't have much time to hurt us on the way up.
Okay. So one last question. Anybody who... Okay. Tim.
Sorry, somebody else.
Oh. Where?
Somebody in the back, I think.
Where? You. You're on, buddy.
As far as like space exploration, do you see that being... I know we talked about like a little bit about the extraterrestrial. Is that almost like a rebellion against God? Is it a way to kind of disprove God by kind of, almost like the Tower of Babel, right?
Is space exploration an effort to disprove God?
Right, modern day space exploration, what do you say?
You want that? Or you want to give that to me? How do you want to do it?
You can have that.
Look, technology is amoral. It's not immoral. It's not moral. It's just a thing. It's what people do with technology. There are many benefits that we all live with today because of the Apollo program and all that. So is there something wrong with space exploration? I can't imagine what. Is it an effort to disprove God? I'm sure for some people it is. But Irwin was a great example of an astronaut. There are actually a number of astronauts who actually had powerful spiritual experiences once they went into space. So are there those who would use that technology in some way to try and disprove God? Sure, there's always people. You find them in the universities. It doesn't have to be science. It can be all sorts of areas. But ultimately, the heavens declare the glory of God, right? And I think that's one of the things I can't remember now who astronomer was. I'd be lying if I came up with his name right now, but he said that anyone who studies the heavens and concludes there's no God is a fool. Because it's obvious as you study the heavens that God's the only one who put all this together. And so, is it an effort to disprove God? I'm sure there's a fool here or there who try to do that. There's a lot of that around us. And that's the beauty of all of us, but especially those who are younger here, because you have more potential right now than those of us who are older because of where you are in your careers. You have a major influence in whatever corporation, university, wherever you are in the marketplace, to have an influence as salt and light where you work. Regardless of what the laws are, the rules are in the corporations where you work, you have a dramatic opportunity to be a testimony for Jesus Christ. So, all right, we are going to close. The counter is still open for anybody who's interested in some DVDs and books. They are already discounted, so now's the time to get them so Bill doesn't have to schlep them all back with him. So let's stand together.